Yeah. But this is like a fun event, and I feel like it's not something we talk about that much.
Yeah.
So.
Super interesting. It's really interesting. We're saying that there's conferences where the same old people show up, talking about the same things, and maybe it's because I don't come to Brussels that often, but a lot of people here don't seem like that. They're not on the kind of conference circuit.
Yeah. I mean, I think even just having it like at this venue, which is 5 minutes outside the bubble, you know, it changes a bit the. Okay, great.
When you ask your first question, I'm tempted to ask people if they
Yeah.
content, but that's okay.
Go crazy. As long as we. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna start. Hello, dear audience. If I may call you back to your seats for the next panel.
It's going to be good.
People say this is the best panel. Sources told me, so.
I think one of those was me.
The other was an EU diplomat. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for staying at this late hour. We will now move on to the digital-focused part of the event. I think we've heard a lot about how content affects people's minds and lives and culture, and how that is mediated through online platforms. So let's dive into exactly how that happens. And on our first panel, we'll focus on moderation in particular, and I have with me Asha Allen from the Center for Democracy and Technology, and Ben Whitelow, a fellow journalist who focuses on moderation. And I'm going to tell you that there will be space for questions at the end, and now I will ask Ben. Ben, can you give us an overview? How does content moderation work? Like, what happens behind the scenes when I post something horrible on my Facebook and then it gets taken down?
Yeah, maybe I can turn that question into one for the audience. Can I ask people to raise their hands if they do any content moderation themselves? So do they run a Discord server? Are they an admin on a WhatsApp group? Are you a kind of moderator on a subreddit? To what extent do you do kind of content moderation in your own digital lives? Hands up, if so. A couple of people, 3, 4, okay. So that's really interesting. I think the process of content moderation is essentially the application of kind of predefined rules, mainly to remove the most egregious content as agreed by that platform. And it's done by a combination of humans and automated systems. And increasingly, we're seeing a shift from one to the other, which we can talk about. I suppose we can talk a bit more about exactly how it works. I think the trade-offs and the difficulties are the most interesting aspects to get into. But my background is in kind of actually running a moderation team myself for a small newsroom back in kind of 2010, 2011. And I think the thing that was worth kind of getting across and communicating is just how difficult it is. I ran a moderation team in a small newsroom. We had 3,000 comments per day on our news website, and the news website was for subscribers only. And I cannot tell you how difficult it was in that tiny, tiny corner of the internet to get everyone to play ball. Incredibly, incredibly tough. If you're interested in doing it, the best way actually is to go and look at a couple of games that have been made about content moderation. One is called Moderator Mayhem, and the other one is called Trust and Safety Tycoon. And those two games kind of, I guess, best encapsulate how difficult it is to take a policy and then apply it in real time to a piece of content that could be anything from 2 words to potentially 1,000 words. And back in the day, that used to be done by humans only, and increasingly that's being done by a combination of humans and automated kind of systems. It's really, really tough. If you then add in the scale at which platforms are working, at which they have content coming from all corners of the world, you can only imagine the kind of difficulty it is to do that. So without going into the kind of boring life of, that I used to have, manning a queue of comments and saying yes or no to them according to the policy, I think that's probably a good starting point.
Thanks, Ben. And Asha, what does that mean for gender-based violence, for discriminatory content? Like, how do platforms define that? Because it's actually can be very hard to define, as Ben was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, gender-based violence is not a concept that even legal and international institutions have had a good time in defining. So in terms of whether platforms have been able to do it is a bit of an enormous question. I kind of want to go on a journey with that question because the way in which platforms have approached how they moderate gender-based violence, I think is quite a good story in terms of how content moderation itself has changed over time. So for those of us who remember the wonderful days of Twitter before a certain Musk turned up and changed everything fundamentally, we will not get into a discussion about that. But in the Twitter days, we've shifted from a human rights due diligence in content moderation is something that we are invested in as platforms. I had the pleasure of sitting on the Twitter Trust and Safety Council many years ago, and they had a dedicated gender-based violence team, and there were genuinely people who, really great people trying to work out how do you do content moderation on an issue which is so deep and so connected to the broader societal issue of that we still live in a sexist, racist society. Surprise, surprise. And so how do you come up with moderation policies in which the experience of gender-based violence is extremely subjective, right? So you had clear efforts, but that has fundamentally shifted not only since Elon bought Twitter and changed it into X, but since we have very clear legal frameworks that now try and codify content moderation into law. And so I think it's really important for us to understand what falls into the realm of illegality, because that is something that is criminal, and there are forms of gender-based violence that fall within that realm. And then there are other things that are not illegal, but still extremely harmful and need to be dealt with through content moderation policies themselves. And so I argued that gender-based violence is probably one of the best examples on why you need to take an intersectional approach when it comes to content moderation policies, but also platform governance in general. We'll talk about it later and it'll be mentioned, but the Digital Services Act goes hand in hand with the Directive on Violence Against Women in Europe, right? The directive criminalizes 4 forms of gender-based violence: non-consensual sharing of sexual images, cyber stalking, cyber harassment. It's very clearly aligned with international law. But you've got the DSA that's supposed to couple it to say, well, platforms still have to mitigate the risk of gender-based violence on their platforms. When it comes to content moderation specifically, unfortunately, the DSA is not prescriptive and it's deliberate. You don't want the regulator saying you have to do this and it needs to be done in a certain way. However, what we've seen, unfortunately, is once the DSA has kind of come into force, some platforms have taken more of an approach of a race to the bottom and when it comes to what they're complying with. The risk assessment reports that we've seen have not really told us much. Some of them haven't touched on gender-based violence at all. Meta changed their hate and conduct policy last year to explicitly allow gendered disinformation, gendered harm, LGBT harm on their platforms, and we've seen it across other platforms. So when it comes to content moderation, I'd say there were concerted efforts, very much specifically focused on gender-based violence, let's say pre-2020 maybe. And after that, I think we've seen quite a juxtaposition in it being posed as this false dichotomy between defending against gender-based violence online and allowing free expression. And they are not a false dichotomy. You can absolutely respect free expression and not allow gender-based violence to be prevalent on your platforms. So I think that's where we are now.
But is that true for the harmful content that you talk about? Because isn't that the more difficult part, right? Trad wife content or manosphere content is not necessarily illegal. It's not calling anyone to violence or depicting violence, but
sure.
it's certainly harmful.
Sure, and I think we can't forget that platforms have their own policies, right? The vast majority of content that's taken down, not just in Europe, but globally, close to 90% of content that's taken down is taken down under platforms' policies. That's the vast majority of it. So a platform is just defining what those parameters are for the content that they allow on their platforms, and they need to be able to assess adequately what harm is and how to mitigate that harm, right? As we were talking about some of the tradwife content, we might be talking about the fact that this is apolitical content at the beginning. But if you're looking at things using an intersectional methodology and understanding how things intersect, a platform might be able to say, well, actually, if I've got a young teenager who's watching this and they're getting this content quite a lot, it might have an impact on their mental health, which is also covered under the DSA. It's about making sure the risk assessments that they do are actually comprehensive and informed by well-established methodologies, but we can't just allow those accountability mechanisms to just go by as an empty tick box exercise to say, yes, we looked into it, but we're not really going to do much. So platforms, we have to remember, not only do we have these legal frameworks, platforms have an obligation under international human rights law to make sure that their products and services don't harm people or undermine their fundamental human rights. So there are multiple ways in which to hold them accountable in that regard.
Yeah, risk assessments are funny because I think a lot of people don't know that about the DSA. Like, one of the main ways that it works is they get big platforms to assess their systemic risks and then try to mitigate them and write that in a report and give it to the commission. So that's one of the big things that the DSA does. But if you look at a lot of risk assessments, as you say, they're insufficient. And I found it really interesting that in X's risk assessment, there was no mention of grok in general, and definitely no mention of grok and CSAM and notification. But speaking of grok, Ben, you talked about the automation of moderation earlier. Is that a trend we are really seeing, and how can we quantify it? And what is the effect of that on everything we talked about around GBV content?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe coming from a kind of operational background, starting as somebody who had to moderate content, I'm particularly interested in the systems that either humans or AI have at their disposal to filter content. And we've had a great discussion today about the kind of language that is used to circumnavigate some of these automated systems. I do think that the systems, the policies and the kind of some of the things we've been talking about today are only as good as the systems that we have or that a human has to filter out that content. So I think kind of, to go away with anything, it's like, it's all well and good for us to have kind of policies that are clear. And as Asha said, there's lots of means of holding platforms to account. But if those platforms don't have the systems then to remove that content, then it's all very, not worthless, but very difficult to go anywhere. I mean, we've had these automated systems since the internet kind of began. There have been spam filters and keyword filtering right since the early days of the internet. And we now have a kind of whole, I would call it a safety tech ecosystem, where companies are trying to sell software into major platforms that kind of address some of these issues. So there are companies that do age assurance technology, which has become a big topic recently, of risk intelligence, of kind of flagging groups and people that might pose harm to other users down the line. There are companies that do tooling that moderators that will make the kind of decision-making process for human moderators more straightforward. There's a whole kind of system and marketplace of tools that these platforms are kind of taking up and utilizing. And I have my kind of story here is that I've been kind of on the receiving end of some of these automated systems in a way that I think is probably quite shocking for people in here. So maybe I'll just quickly tell that story. I posted a link to a newsletter edition that contained the subject line, something about Pornhub. Pornhub had done something related to content moderation, and I wrote about it in the newsletter. Before I could hit publish on LinkedIn, so I tried to share this with other kind of people in my network, it said that the link was malware, and I wasn't able to post it. And I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder why that is. Turns out that LinkedIn hadn't kind of censored me or kind of necessarily banned me, but they had received a signal from another safety tech provider that my domain was potentially kind of malware. And so I went to that company based in Spain, and said, look, LinkedIn has prevented me from posting this. Can you kind of unblock me in whatever systems you have? They said, unfortunately, we actually use another system based in Malaysia, and we're passing that signal onwards to LinkedIn. And so I had to go to Malaysia, not in person. I've messaged somebody on Facebook, a very dormant account for a company called Radar, and they said, yes, your domain has been blocked for reasons we don't know. And so you have this kind of crazy kind of system of safety technology, automated safety technology, that gets rolled up from kind of small Malaysian startup to Spanish provider to major platform, and kind of inadvertently captures people in this system like me. Now, no one cares if my newsletter link wasn't published onto LinkedIn. No one cares about that. But other people who have, stories that matter and whose content needs to be out into the world, they will face the kind of issues related to these automated systems. And I think it's something that is not fundamentally kind of known about how platforms moderate content. I would say that regulation has increased the likelihood that automated systems will be used as well, because moderation decisions have to be trackable and justifiable in ways that we've talked about today at length. So, the next panel is going to talk about the importance of means of redress when platforms take down content that they shouldn't. But this idea of kind of automated systems being increasingly a key part of how content is moderated online, I think is a big one.
But do you think they're better or worse? Like, are we getting more precise, or are they just a way for platforms to, not have as many people looking at content, which is perhaps a valid cause in itself?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's twofold. It's responding to regulation. There is a kind of content moderation is becoming more compliance-like. So you have to tick a box in order to show that you are doing moderation in a way that you can justify, essentially. A lot of moderation decisions are now captured in databases like the one that the kind of commission has. And for that to happen, you need to have kind of systems that allow those decisions to be tracked and stored. That's going to cause a lot of false flags. We already know throughout the last 20 years that actually it's very hard to contextualize content. We've seen lots of examples today of words that can be used in ways that are very harmful, but actually fundamentally don't, on their own, kind of violate any policies. And the kind of famous "Free the Nipple" campaign was about images of female breasts being classified in ways that were different to men's, and there's many examples of that. So I think it's not necessarily a good thing. The platforms are doing it because they have to, and also because there's a cost-saving element to it.
Thank you for that. I want to pick up on something you said earlier, Asha, because you said that platforms are already obligated to do things about gender-based violence around, just international human rights law. So why are they? And if not, why are they not doing that much about it?
I think this actually connects to the point that you were just making about the choices that they make and what they prioritize, right? I think if we look into what's been deprioritized in terms of hate and conduct policies, you can see that gender-based violence has been lowered in this regard. And also some of those legal frameworks still have to come into effect. So Europe adopted the Directive on Violence Against Women last year, and I have to give a shout out to all of the advocates who worked on that, because that literally took 25 years to convince the European Commission to do that and for the member states to adopt it. But that only comes into effect in member states next year. So that legal framework is not really in place yet, but we know it's coming, and a lot of member states have their own laws around kind of NCII and things like this. But when you take something that goes from a human rights due diligence measure and a company's trying to show something from that perspective to a compliance, it even changes teams, right? And you don't even have the same people working on it. So companies over the last few years have just en masse fired their trust and safety teams. And a lot of these teams were like human rights experts themselves. They came from civil society, they were researchers, they were academics, they were very well-intentioned advocates placed internally to create frameworks to concretely address the issues. But now when you hand that over to a compliance team, they're looking at what's the legal lowest limit to which we can comply with this, and they're looking at it from an economic perspective, right? So what's the percentage in which we have to now address specific types of content to say that we comply with this law, right? So if a platform is coming from a different incentivized place, they're not looking at it through the lens in which, you know, human rights due diligence comes from. And so this is where I think we're seeing that clear deterioration. Interestingly, the Digital Services Act doesn't codify anything platforms weren't doing before. In fact, it's almost fully informed by what platforms were doing before and said they were doing before, right? They were doing voluntary risk assessments. They were doing voluntary audits. They had trusted flaggers in place. That, you know, they were doing all these things before, but suddenly now it's too hard and we can't comply because it's codified in law. I think that's a choice that's being made, right? And so where that prioritization comes from. But similarly, as they've moved to that kind of more compliance exercise and those trust and safety teams have dissolved, civil society don't have contact points anymore of who they're talking to. So those of us who are monitoring how gender-based violence has evolved, there are many organizations who could have told you that the Grok situation was coming. Months ago, they could have told you that the Grok situation was coming. But platforms are not engaging with civil society organizations. They have a kind of request. I don't say request. I think they're mandated to, but they'll argue with me whether that's legally the case. But they should be consulting with civil society organizations under their DSA obligations, but they don't, right? We have a swathe of organizations who tell us they're not talking to us.